Welcome to Echoes of History, a Ubisoft podcast brought to you by History Hit. This is the place to explore the rich stories from the past that bring the world of Assassin's Creed to life. I'm Matt Lewis. Join me as we explore the dark underbelly of Victorian London. Assassin's Creed Syndicate takes place in 1868. It's an essential part of British history since the culture and economy of modern Britain was shaped by the remarkable processes and people of the 19th century. So I wanted to spend some time looking at the context that informs the world of Assassin's Creed Syndicate. In this episode, Dr. Jonah Miller will guide us through the birth of the Metropolitan Police and their iconic headquarters at Scotland Yard. Alex Churchill will give an insight into the personality of the woman who gave her name to the era, Queen Victoria. And Tom Furber from the London Archives will explain the most important event in Western history, the Industrial Revolution. Let's dive into the echoes of history. Jonah, thank you so much for joining us on Echoes of History. I can't wait to find out more about Scotland Yard.
Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
To start us off with, maybe people in London know precisely what we're talking about when we say Scotland Yard, but for those of us who live in the murky darkness beyond London, what are we talking about when we say Scotland Yard? What do we mean?
Well, Scotland Yard is a place, but it's also a way of referring to an institution. So it's a place, it's in Whitehall, and it's where the headquarters of the Metropolitan Police were for most of the 19th century. So Scotland Yard kind of became synonymous with the police and with detectives as a whole.
And today we need to be a little bit careful because the Metropolitan Police isn't the only police force in London. So Scotland Yard actually means something really, really specific in London.
Yeah, so the Metropolitan Police Force was set up in 1829, and it's the first modern, organised, professional, hierarchical police force in Britain, not the first in the UK, because several earlier versions were set up in Ireland, and they were kind of the inspiration for it. And it starts off just being the area of Westminster, Whitehall, and a few miles around. It's not the City of London, very importantly, for people who are proud of the city's traditions. The city has its own police force, and then it expands. So for most of the 19th century, it's a 15-mile radius from Charing Cross is the Metropolitan Police District.
And why was Scotland Yard the Metropolitan Police? Why was it located on that spot in Whitehall? Why was it put there?
This is kind of one of the interesting things about what 19th century policing actually was and the legacy that it's left to us. Earlier forms of policing had been very, very localised and very much under kind of local control of parishes and wards in cities. And what really changes with 1829 is the Met was directly connected to the government, the central government, through the Home Office. So the reason that the Met headquarters were in this place called Scotland Yard, which is basically on Whitehall, where the civil service was, is that originally it was basically a branch of the Home Office. So the Metropolitan Police Commissioners answered directly to the Home Secretary, as they still do. And this kind of link between central government and policing is really one of the big changes in 1829.
The one thing we haven't addressed yet is why on earth the Metropolitan Police located in Whitehall are called Scotland Yard. Where does that name come from?
The address is number 4 Whitehall Place. So this is a set of kind of higgledy-piggledy Victorian government buildings off a little side street off Whitehall, which is the big road that connects Trafalgar Square and Parliament Square. This number 4 Whitehall Place backs onto a place called Scotland Yard, which is a yard, it's a courtyard. And when it was first created, there were kind of two functions for this building. One was that it was an administrative office for the commissioners. There were the commissioners and their clerks and lots of people doing lots of paperwork. And the other one, it was this police station for Division A of the Metropolitan Police, which is sometimes called the Home Division, which kind of policed Whitehall, basically. And their station looked out onto the back, onto Scotland Yard. So their force became known as the Scotland Yard Force, and the name stuck, basically. So then the whole setup began to be referred to as Scotland Yard.
It's an interesting evolution of the name, isn't it? So people would maybe say, I'm going to Scotland Yard, meaning I'm going to the entranceway to the Metropolitan Police building at Whitehall, and Scotland Yard is the bit that weirdly stuck as the name for the whole organisation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess number 4 Whitehall Place doesn't quite roll off the tongue in the same way. And I mean, the thing that really kind of entrenches that name, Scotland Yard, is the creation of a detective force, which comes a little bit later. It's 1842 is the detective, as it's known. And they operate out of this kind of back set of buildings looking over Scotland Yard. So they are the people who really get associated with that name, Scotland Yard, so-and-so of the yard. And that obviously lasts well into the 20th century.
Do we have any idea why a square, a yard in the middle of Whitehall is named Scotland Yard? Is there a connection to Scotland at all?
There is. It's a little bit murky. Whitehall was a royal palace for a very, very long time before it became the kind of centre of the civil service. And in the late medieval period and into the early modern period, this particular part of Whitehall may have been where visiting Scottish royals would stay when they came to visit English monarchs. That's the kind of the story that's usually told, and it's probably more or less true, but there's really very little documentation, so it's quite hard to be certain.
Who then is responsible for the rise of a police force and its basing in Whitehall? Why does London suddenly need a police force?
The person who is sort of most strongly associated with this is Robert Peel. So he's the one who gives police officers some of their nicknames like Peelers and Bobbies.
So Bobbies is from Robert, Peelers is from Peel.
Yeah, exactly. Slightly oddly, this is almost more a story about Ireland than about London. Robert Peel, later on in the 19th century, he becomes Prime Minister, but the point where we're talking about him, he's Home Secretary, but before that, he has been Chief Secretary for Ireland. And what he's done in that job is create police forces. So he's created a couple of different police forces, and they're the first people to be known as Peelers in Ireland. And then when he becomes Home Secretary, in London in the 1820s, there are lots of people worrying about rising crime rates. And Robert Peel likes setting up police forces. He likes the idea of government having a kind of set of men who can carry out orders and keep order and enforce law in a kind of centralized way. So he basically takes advantage of this atmosphere of some people saying that, crime rates are going up and we need to do something. And he pushes through an act for the improvement of the police of the metropolis, which is the 1829 Act that creates the Metropolitan Police.
It's interesting that it's an Irish template in a place called Scotland Yard that is so intimately associated with the city of London. It's a fascinating set of connections there.
There are more Irish connections as you go forward as well. I mean, so the first 2 police commissioners who Peel chooses, Colonel Charles Rowan, who is an Irish soldier, and an Irish barrister called Richard Mayne. And the idea is that both of them know how police forces work because they've got experience of the Irish police forces.
There's a perception in London, I guess, whether the statistics back it up or not, there's a perception that crime is growing. Is this a symptom of London itself expanding as a city, the increasing urbanisation of society? We're heading full steam into the Industrial Revolution period. Is there a sense that as more people pile in there needs to be some form of organised policing of the law in the city? Absolutely.
So, I mean, the population of London is going absolutely through the roof in the sort of late 18th and early 19th century. And lots of people say that the old institutions just can't handle it. They're not up to it. And what does happen even before 1829 is that quite a lot of the local authorities carry out police reform on a kind of micro level. So a lot of parishes and the City of London, the old corporation of London in the square mile, all of them in the early 19th century are sort of getting local acts of parliament passed. They're kind of tinkering with their local law enforcement structures. So they do have professional officers out on the beat, particularly at night. And one of the kind of curiosities of 1829 is that there's all this big fanfare and, Peel announces that there's a new police for the metropolis. But at first, there are actually fewer officers on the beat after 1829 than there were before, because a lot of the old kind of parochial night watch forces get swept away and they're replaced with this new centralized force, which at the beginning doesn't have the numbers. I mean, they haven't recruited enough and they just can't operate on that scale at first.
And those local parish level police forces, presumably if they're not put in place by the government, they're being run by parish councils. It's coming down to how good the parish council is, how interested they are in law and order, how much money they have to spend. So presumably the wealthy areas who maybe have less crime anyway are the ones who weirdly can afford to be better policed than the areas who might need better policing. And maybe that's the intended benefit of a unified police force, that everywhere will get covered.
Absolutely. Before 1829, the parishes that have the best, the largest at least, night watch forces are places in West London where the membership of the parish, like half the people on, it would be called the vestry rather than the parish council, half the people on the vestry are titled. They're perfectly happy to kind of splash a bit of cash to have lots of people protecting their property from burglars. Whereas in East London, around the docks, there are parishes where you don't have a resident duke. And so people are paying for local law enforcement through local taxes, through parish taxes. That doesn't mean they have nobody working on the beat, but it does mean that they don't have the kind of same scale of resources as in West London. That said, what they do have is some control over local law enforcement. So if you're a parish ratepayer, you pay your parish taxes, then you're effectively the boss of the night watch.
I have absolutely no desire to get political with this. I'm just struck as we're talking about how some things really haven't changed. We get increasing populations in cities that lead to a perception that there's an increase in crimes, that we're currently grappling with problems of, is it better to devolve power to local regional police forces and mayors and things like that, or is it better to have it all centralised? It seems like these were things that they were thinking about and juggling with 200 years ago. We almost haven't got entirely away from them. So it's not meant as any kind of political comment on anything, just an observation that the world never really changes, does it? So Syndicate, the game, is set in 1868. So we're 40 years into the life of the Metropolitan Police Force here. If you and I walked into Scotland Yard to report a crime in 1868, do we know what that building might have looked like, what might have welcomed us as we walked through the door?
The first thing we would see, I think, would be just enormous piles of paper everywhere. It was almost immediately overwhelmed by the amount of bureaucracy required to run a kind of citywide police force. And these were old, slightly dilapidated buildings that all had labyrinthine corridors connecting them together. There's a nice quote from the Times that describes Scotland Yard as a dingy collection of mean buildings in a state of hopeless confusion. It's a sort of Dickensian image of a kind of chaotic bureaucracy. Huge stacks of paper everywhere, clerks running around between them trying to find the right document. Also, of course, a load of police officers who in 1868 have just had a kind of major reform of their uniform. They've just got helmets rather than reinforced top hats.
Whoa, wait, reinforced top hats? This is what police are wearing? That's amazing.
From 1829 until the 1860s, the uniform of the Metropolitan Police Officer is a reinforced top hat, a cape, and a big overcoat, all dark blue. And then in the 1860s, partly because they are increasingly worried that police officers are basically not properly protected, they start getting helmets. Though that's also connected to a kind of call from some quarters for a more military style of police. So again, around the same time as you get helmets introduced, you get military style drill, you get lots of calls for police officers to be armed. This is from around the middle of the 19th century. The Colt revolver is appearing more and more in London in the hands of suspected criminals. And there are these cartoons showing a burglar with a Colt revolver up against a police officer with a reinforced top hat and a stick. The suggestion is the police need more defence and more equipment. So there are some people saying that the police should carry guns. There are some people saying they should at least carry cutlasses. And this is when they get their helmets. They've also just, at this point, recently been allowed to grow beards for the first time. And also in the 1860s, this is the first time that they are allowed to appear in public, not in uniform, even when off duty. From 1829 until the 1860s, police officers have to wear their uniform all the time. And the only signifier that they're on duty is a little sort of armband, which they don't wear when they're off duty.
I'd never known that. That's absolutely unbelievable that you would have to wear your work uniform all the time, even when you're not at work, is something I think we would find incredibly weird today. And whilst I'll say I find that weird, I'm also writing myself a note to start a petition immediately after this to bring back reinforced top hats and capes for police officers. I mean, stab vests and everything else, absolutely great. Reinforced top hats and capes has got to be where it's at. While we're on the uniformed police officers, do we know what kind of equipment they would have carried? You mentioned, they're not armed with pistols. There's that cartoon of them with a reinforced top hat and a stick. Do we know what actual policing equipment they would have carried that we might recognise today?
They do. They have truncheons all the way through. They have truncheons. So that's the kind of the baseline. I guess the things that change are that periodically they do get issued with cutlasses, and periodically they do also get issued with revolvers. In every instance, this is very controversial. From the beginning, there are lots of people who are very, very nervous about having a police force like this at all. This is why in the aftermath of the 1829 Act, so in the 1830s, it's really pretty touch and go. There are lots of people saying we should just go back on this, we should abolish them and go back to the old sort of localized system. And the key kind of argument for that is that this is a form of military rule, and it's worse in the eyes of a 19th century British person, it's French-style military rule. This idea of kind of police officers with weapons controlled by the central government is very strongly associated with France, and France is associated with kind of tyranny and despotism. And it's the right of the freeborn Briton to be policed by people who are not militarized agents of central government. So that's why when police do turn up with weapons, it causes a big backlash. And the Home Office is kind of constantly trying to navigate this, these kind of conflicting priorities. And the fact of the blue uniform, which is now embedded in our police mythology, is all about suggesting that police officers are not soldiers. They don't have a red uniform. And the blue is supposed to be a kind of softer, more civilian-friendly way of showing that these are figures of authority.
Did they carry handcuffs during this period? Did they have the famous whistle? We think of Victorian policemen blowing their whistle to attract help, or all of those kinds of things around at this time too?
Handcuffs go way back. They predate the creation of the new police forces. The whistle in the early 19th century, they tend to have a rattle. I mean, not totally dissimilar to a kind of toddler's rattle, a thing that you shake and it makes a very loud noise. Further back in time, there are bells. So there's a kind of crossover between the watchman and the bellman. There are various ways that police officers can use these kind of instruments to call on each other.
And you mentioned a little bit earlier that we've also entered the period in which there are detectives, so non-uniformed police officers. Do we have any idea of how London has reacted to plainclothes police? Because if you're expecting your police force to be in their uniform all of the time, even when they're not on duty, how do they translate that into a force that don't wear any uniform at all and don't identify themselves as policemen?
They're not popular. The story, I guess, really starts before the actual creation of a detective branch, when the Metropolitan Police in the 1830s, they send some officers in plain clothes to spy on radical political meetings. So there's a guy called Sergeant Popeye who goes to spy on the meetings of it's called the National Union of the Working Classes. He basically becomes an agent provocateur. So he pretends that he's a kind of out of work painter and starts suggesting that they kind of blow up government buildings and do really radical, dangerous things. He's then recognized when he's on duty in uniform by one of his supposed comrades from the National Union of Working Classes. And this becomes a massive scandal. It triggers a royal commission to investigate the Metropolitan Police. And there's a whole sort of newspaper explosion about the idea that there are these spies everywhere who are going to kind of control people and suppress their political rights and lead them to do crazy things like blow up buildings. So that's the background. And then when you actually get detectives in 1842, they're essentially, to combat that, there's a huge propaganda effort to say that these aren't spies. These are a kind of useful branch of the police system, and they can help us make sure that burglars and murderers are brought to justice. And part of that propaganda campaign is Charles Dickens, who writes lots of articles. I mean, he's best friends with one of the first leading inspectors, who's Charlie Field. And Charlie Field and Dickens kind of have dinner together, and they talk a lot about detective work. And Dickens writes these articles for newspapers accompanying Charlie Field out walking around the East London slums at night. And then we have Inspector Bucket in Bleak House, who's the kind of iconic Victorian detective. And that sort of leads to the subsequent 19th century boom in detective fiction. And that is all in a way part of this propaganda effort to say it's all right to have plainclothes police officers. They're not spying on you. They're not trying to kind of trick you into doing something that will land you in prison. They are actually useful parts of the system.
And so outside of the station, the building of Scotland Yard, in Syndicate, you will encounter police officers roaming around the streets all of the time. Do we have any concept of how they policed London? Are there, surviving instruction manuals? Do we know how violent they were? Did they arrest people in the same way that we do today? Obviously, they must have had different policing methods. Do we know how effective they were? Did people support this idea of a police force once it had got itself established?
There are lots of surviving instructions, and the thing that's really striking about them, I guess, and the thing that becomes very controversial, is that the way that the new police, as well as being centralised and run by the Home Office, the way that the new police are different is that they basically launch a kind of an assault on working class street life. So they go for street gambling, they go for people playing games and causing obstructions of traffic. They go for sex workers. They go for essentially any activity that looks disorderly and that interferes with sort of idealized middle-class version of the city, where everybody who's moving around the city is on legitimate business and is kind of going about making money. It's this very sort of Victorian industrial era commercial attitude to what London life is supposed to be like. And lots of working class people don't fit into that idealized image. And this means that in the early years in particular, the kind of interference Metropolitan Police bring to street life, they're raiding pubs all the time because they're unlicensed premises, and to gambling as well in particular. That kind of interference makes them extremely unpopular with lots of working class people.
Sounds like they're becoming the fun police at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a kind of backing down, essentially. In part, they're being given a completely impossible task. After the first sort of decade or so, or maybe the first couple of decades, the instructions do sort of start to emphasize you really shouldn't be interfering where it's not absolutely necessary. You shouldn't be interfering where there isn't some kind of breach of the peace going on.
Yeah, again, and one that hasn't entirely gone away, has it? There are still arguments today about what the police should be doing, shouldn't be doing, where they should spend their time and what they should investigate. So I'm amazed by how relevant some of these early policing questions still are today. So Scotland Yard isn't in Scotland Yard anymore, and yet we still call it Scotland Yard. We still associate that place with the institution. Why do you think it became so immortal? I don't know.
I think there's a couple of things. Maybe one is that the police were a new thing in the first half of the 19th century, and people were kind of calling them all sorts of different things. So there's there's the peelers and the bobbies. There are also a lot more very rude names or sort of hostile names. They get called bludgeon men, they get called blue locusts, they get called all sorts of things. But the thing about Scotland Yard, I think, the name is that it's a name that doesn't highlight the connection with central government. So it's quite a nice name from the point of view of the Met. They're quite happy to kind of hang on to it because it isn't, number 4 Whitehall Place, which makes you think of Whitehall, which makes you think of the Home Office or the Civil Service. And it means that they're not called the government police or the state police or any of these things that they're desperately trying to avoid being called. So Scotland Yard is actually quite handy for them because it sort of doesn't have any of those associations.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that hadn't occurred to me, because they don't have to mention, as you say, the connection to government, Whitehall, the Home Office. They don't have to use the word metropolitan, which implies some widespread power and authority. They don't even use the word police if they call themselves Scotland Yard. So all of the words that might have a negative connotation for an early police force can be circumvented by just naming it after the place where it is. I'd never thought of it like that, but it actually works, doesn't it?
And the place itself does kind of get more attention in the 1880s because Scotland Yard is bombed in 1884 by so-called Fenians, by Irish nationalists. They sort of don't place the bomb in quite the right place. So they blow up an empty office, which is attached to Scotland Yard, and they also blow up a neighbouring pub called the Sun with nobody in it. The landlord of the Sun then makes loads of money by charging people to come and see the wreckage of his pub. But that kind of draws lots of attention to Scotland Yard as a place and as a kind of, I guess, a British institution which is seen as being under attack from Irish nationalism. And in fact, it's in the aftermath of that bombing that what's called the Special Irish Branch, which later becomes Special Branch, is created.
Just to round off our conversation about the idea of Scotland Yard and the place of Scotland Yard, I guess, why is it not at Scotland Yard anymore? Presumably at some point it has to move for some reason.
Yeah, so this is 1890 when basically they move because, the stacks of paper get too high and there are so many clerks that they start kind of colliding with each other in the corridors. Essentially, they outgrow the buildings. And so they move to what is called New Scotland Yard, which is a building on the embankment. So this is part of the story of Victorian London, that part of the Thames kind of disappears under the Victoria embankment. And it's initially a site that was supposed to be a new National Opera House. But then the person who's kind of trying to do that runs out of money. And so the Met step in and say, we'll buy this. It's a sort of grand red Victorian building. Somebody calls it a very constabulary kind of castle. So New Scotland Yard, they have this huge building to themselves. And that sort of works for about 70 years into the 20th century. But then in 1967, essentially the same problem occurs again, which is that there's too much paper and too many people, too many administrators. So they move again to what is now New Scotland Yard, but probably ought to be called New Scotland Yard, which is the present site with the kind of big rotating sign that you see on the news.
That's my image of New Scotland Yard. So it's interesting to know where that emerged from and the steps that have been gone through to get there. To what extent do you think the emergence of a police force helped to shape 19th century London and redefine people's attitudes to law and order on the streets?
It's part of the reshaping of the city. And it's part of this drive by government to make London, which in the 18th century was an incredibly chaotic city, to make it orderly and to kind of constrain the huge mass of people to kind of conform to certain ideas of how people are supposed to behave in urban space. And this is why, for example, we didn't mention this earlier, but this is why one of the kind of signature moves of the Victorian police officer is to say, move on, to move people on. That what this is really about is kind of stopping blockages in the circulation of the city system. Anybody whose activities don't fit with the kind of idealized model of how the city is supposed to operate, they become the targets of the new police. And it doesn't work in a sort of basic way. They don't manage to kind of make London an incredibly orderly and perfectly harmonious city. But it does mean that people are now kind of navigating this system in their daily lives. So people see police officers on the beat all the time. They become part of the kind of furniture of the city. It means that the government and the state, if you want, are kind of very, very present in everyday life in a new way.
And have been ever since, I guess, to this very day. Welcome to Echoes of History, Alex. It's fantastic to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Can we start off with, I guess, when and where is Victoria born and what do we know about her parents and her family?
So the big thing with Victoria is she's basically part of a scramble to populate the throne, I guess. There's lots of uncles, but the upshot of it is there's a succession crisis in a way because of George IV not having an heir all the way down, which means the throne is going sideways to his brothers. And the brothers are having a race, effectively, to produce an heir first. And she is the winner. She's like the Derby winner, basically, in baby form. But when she's born, her name isn't even Victoria. It's Drina, so short for Alexandrina. Victoria is her mother's name, so it's kind of slung in as an afterthought, as a middle name. There's always people that have got a vested interest in interfering with their upbringing because they might get something out of them later on. There's always a guy with ulterior motives, and in this case it's Conroy. What he does is infiltrate her household as her mother's lover and take control of everything. And what he ultimately wants is to almost to rule through her. Like, the monarchy is a nightmare at the time. It's not in good standing with the people. You've had George III and his nuttiness, bless him. You've had George IV and his overspending, and he's just not nice. And then William IV he's all right, but he's just a gruff sailor. That's what he is. He's not really born to be king, and he does all right. He doesn't cause any more damage. By the time she comes to the throne, people are not expecting much from her, and they're going to get a surprise, which is nice to know. But Conroy has positioned himself to come to power, and what he tries to do is get papers signed that say that he'll effectively be a regent until she knows what she's doing, or until she turns 18. And William IV, God love him, if he does one thing right, it's survive until 1 month after her 18th birthday. The mental well-being and physical well-being is in doubt in the last few years of living under a roof with that man. It's violent in terms of like arguments, and it's stressful, and it's not good for her. And what she does do is, the second that she does come to the throne, instead of collapsing and letting him take control, she punts him out and he never gets another look in. And it involves punting her mother out of any influence as well. It shapes her for the future because it makes her so fiercely protective of her birthright, and does make her determined not to be stomped on ever again.
Do you think it galvanised her in any way to think that a woman shouldn't allow herself to be treated like that?
It's going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, because she was contradictory about it. This is someone who insists on leaving the honour and obey in her wedding vows, but throws stuff at her husband if he gets too uppity and takes too much of her power away. And she rages against physically what being a woman and a queen does. And we'll get to it, because it's the forced repetitive childbirth and what it does to a woman's body makes her so angry. But actually, I think the making of Queen Victoria is when all of those men are removed and there are none of them left. And that's when Albert dies. And I actually think that she comes out of that a much stronger human being. Like, we're fast forwarding here, but when we get to the end, like, he wouldn't have recognised her in 1880, 1890 as the woman he was married to.
When precisely then does Victoria become queen, and how quickly do we see a change in her attitude?
It is a happy occurrence that poor William lasts till 1837, 1 month past her 18th birthday, so she is of age, but she's cripplingly immature. She has a lot to learn in terms of dealing with people, but it's not like she's been uneducated about what being a queen involves. But yeah, she doesn't go nuts. She doesn't do whatever the 1830s girl equivalent is of hookers and blows. She's not out there like on a Vegas weekend blowing all her money and shunning her responsibilities. But definitely there's a joy in, like, I can go out into the world and enjoy things like going to the opera now, and I'm not controlled my every waking moment by this swine that I could not get out of my household for love nor money. So she does enjoy that. She's never gonna not like being in charge. She definitely likes that aspect of her reign, sometimes a little too much. She is the last one that doesn't quite get the concept of constitutional monarchies.
And Victoria will famously rule for a very, very long time. When we think of the 19th century now, we very much think of Queen Victoria, and she dominates our thinking for that whole period, I think.
In every way possible, the world will not be the same by the time she dies. It's such a span. She's born in 1819, so she's born 4 years after Waterloo, and she dies a decade before the First World War. So there's a massive amount of time to deal with. I think in terms of her and the royal family, at this point, they're at a very low ebb with the public. They are not popular. She's about to kind of become the saviour in a way of the British monarchy without the huge fanfare of saying it, just by actions. And as I said, this is a huge PR exercise to convince people that they are just like us and these people aren't monsters and they're not out having decadent orgies while you're all struggling to earn a living. So she's on the brink of becoming part of a huge change in how people see the monarchy and how the monarchy operates as well, like for a modern age.
Is there any way that we can give a kind of a broad sweep to her reign? Obviously, Albert will arrive, children will arrive, but is there a short version of Victoria's reign?
Yeah, so it comes in blocks. Block number 1, come to the throne, lean on Melbourne, learn the job, get married, spend about 10 years punching out kids. Takes up to Albert dying. Albert dying, low point. But even then, you feel, oh, she disappeared and no one saw her for 15 years. No, not true. She disappeared from social life. She did not stop doing her job. She did it all the way through. But I would take that second block all the way through to like 1870-ish, which is where she stopped having children. She's a middle-aged woman. She's been a grieving widow. She's been out of the public eye somewhat by her own volition because she just doesn't want to engage with people. But she is still doing her job, her constitutional role. And then from the 1880s on, she becomes very much this stately, motherly figure. I found it immeasurably sad going through those diaries and letters, watching her lose her grip on her place in the world. And she couldn't see properly, so she couldn't read properly. And in that, you've got Abdul Karim as well. Abdul Karim, I feel, is like, if you're a woman in your 80s and 90s and you're a queen and you can't pay to have some eye candy hang around you, then why are you even doing the job? And I feel like that's what he was. But he gave her something as well. He gave her a huge measure of happiness because he gave her something new and shiny. She wasn't just waiting to die. He taught her how to speak Hindi. He taught her about Indian culture. He taught her how to make curries. He made her excited about something again. And you know what? If you want to take that away from your mum and be a dick about it like Edward VII was, then I'm going to judge you, not her. Because she was an old lady and there must be a point where she's sitting there and she's immobile and she's not well and she's losing her eyesight where she's thinking, why am I still here? And I would love to explore that better, because there's a period in there as well where it looks like despite all of her hard work and despite bashing out 9 children that actually her dynasty might not carry on because all the heirs almost die at once.
One of the other challenges, we're talking here loosely about Assassin's Creed, is that she's forced to survive numerous assassination attempts, which must have been pretty scary for someone who liked going out in the park a lot in public.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit scary, but actually she's badge of honour. She says, I must be so important for 8 of them to try to come at me. The first one, she's actually 3 months pregnant with Vicky. That's really early in the reign. And that makes people think, oh, she may be 18 and very small, but she appears to have some backbone because she's having a carriage ride in Hyde Park. And they try to kill her. And she literally ducks, puts her head up. They take him down. She goes, can we finish the carriage ride now, please? And everyone thinks, wow, that's quite cool. But I was expecting wailing and crying and screaming and a lot more drama. She surprises people with that one. My favourite one is one of the later ones. There was a parade going on through Windsor. So because obviously Windsor and Eton are basically the same place, all the Eton College schoolboys had come out to watch. And they took the would-be assassin down. So this guy ended up pinned on the floor while schoolboys in top hats beat him with umbrellas, which I think is hilarious. Like, she very much mocked them and laughed it off as if they were insignificant, which actually PR-wise is about the best thing you can do.
Probably my enduring image of Victoria is the photo that we have, I guess, the older lady, the larger lady, looking particularly grumpy. And we have this image of her being quite a spiky, hard person to deal with. Do you think that's a fair reflection of her personality?
No, not at all, really. It depended on who you were. If she didn't like you, hell yeah. Like, also, as well, you'll notice, try and find pictures of her where she's staring right at the camera. They're very, very rare, and they're because the cameraman caught her off guard because she doesn't believe that you should be allowed to stare upon majesty. She splits 2 eras. At the beginning of her reign, you had to paint a portrait, and you can airbrush a lot out with a portrait. But then if you're waving a camera around in 1900, you can see all the fat, you can see the age. And I don't think she was particularly impressed with how lifelike it became with the photograph compared to those sort of doll-like portraits you see of her in the 1830s. Also, so Prince Albert had cultivated this domesticity, this middle-class domesticity that we still associate with the royal family today. All of those Winterhalter portraits of the family all gathered around the feet of Albert and Victoria, they're PR, they're crafted PR to make them look like a happy domestic unit, which is in contravention of everything that had gone before she came to the throne. Crowning it, this is like the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha royal family, this is not the Georgians. Just in bullet point form, she is funny. She's got a disgusting laugh, really dirty laugh. She's greedy. She loves food. She loves stuff in her face. She's got no problem being dicks to people if she doesn't like them. But she's also very sweet and very caring as well with her female relatives. And she's very unsqueamish about the realities of her job and what it involves. So she loves the idea of Britain having an empire and ruling the world and everything. But she understands that that only comes through hideous violence. She's okay with that. It's not a stance we would appreciate today, but she understands that there's no nice way to do it and that it's going to be done through bloodshed. And I think it's interesting that the royal family as an institution, which people look at and go, they're crazy. Why do they still have that now? It's because they stood above stuff that would have destroyed them. Although they are stupendously rich and depressingly well off, they do work hard at the job they have made for themselves, because that job is born with Prince Albert. The fact that the royal family identified what needed to be done to sort of be palatable to a public going on as well, that definitely starts in her reign. Definitely Albert and Victoria are the basis for the monarchy we have today.
You can listen to the full interview about Queen Victoria and her fondness for painkillers and hunky men by clicking on the link in the description to listen to the Echoes of History podcast, or follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome to Echoes of History, Tom. It's fantastic to have you here.
No, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I can't wait to get into this episode all about the Industrial Revolution, because this is my neck of the woods. You know, part of my family is from Willenhall, firmly in the Black Country, and I am sitting here not too far away from Iron Bridge. So this is an area that's really protective about its Industrial Revolution history. So this is one I'm really looking forward to finding out more about.
And me too. And I'm quite parochial, I must say. I work for the London Archives, so I'm quite London focused. But hopefully, between the two of us, we can cover all the areas of the Industrial Revolution.
What would life have been like in Britain, kind of on the eve of the Industrial Revolution, before all of this really kicks off?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And not for the first time today, you're going to hear me say, well, that depends when you start something. So one of the things I'm sure we'll kind of touch on a lot as the conversation unfolds is how historians sort of disagree about when this happens, when that happens, or they disagree what you call a certain thing. So it's hard to say exactly when the Industrial Revolution starts. But a safe bet, I'm not going to get in too much trouble if I say about 1750 is sort of a common date, around 1750 as the start of the Industrial Revolution. So what was life like in London and the UK before 1750? Well, the first thing to say is it would be far more rural. That is, most people lived in the countryside, and far more agricultural. So most people would have worked on the land. Around 1500, we can say about 75% of people worked in agriculture, worked in farming, and about another sort of a little under 20%, we might say, sort of 18%, would have worked in the countryside or not in the land, and only about 7% of people would have worked in an urban setting, so town or city. By 1750, that's starting to change. In rough numbers, 25% of people live in towns and cities, and the rest live in the countryside. But interestingly, the proportion of people working on the land, as opposed to working in what we might call like proto-industry, has changed. So about 45% of people work on the land, and the rest work in the countryside, but in sort of small domestic workshop settings.
Okay, so the profile of people across the country is beginning to change even before we hit the Industrial Revolution period proper.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we will find is that it's a gradual process. You know, we can kind of always go kind of further and further back and like look at antecedents of things are changing. But that's right. There is a changing pattern of work, and many historians think that that's the key to why the Industrial Revolution happened in Britain kind of grows out of that.
Yes, I think there's always a danger to think that one day someone out in a field somewhere struck a bit of coal in the ground, and then suddenly everyone moved to the city and it was all smoggy, and that's it. It happened overnight.
Exactly that. And then maybe the term itself has something to blame. Industrial Revolution, that does imply something that happens quite quickly. Maybe the term is a bit misleading. I think we could think of it as a gradual change, and the revolution comes in with the significance of the change, not necessarily the speed of it.
More like an industrial evolution.
Indeed. I believe undergraduates across the land have to write essays on evolution or revolution. Yeah.
And what are some of the factors that are contributing to that change? So in the build-up to the Industrial Revolution, what is causing people to move away from working the land and towards town and city life more and more?
So there's quite a few. It's quite an exhaustive list that kind of all kind of come together at the same time. We can start with changes on the land itself. So before the Industrial Revolution, historians often talk about an agricultural revolution. So the agricultural revolution starts in the 17th century, the upshot of which is that the land is more productive in general. A given bit of land is more productive. more land is brought under cultivation, so less people are needed to work the land, and each of those people working the land can produce more stuff. So lots of good things. That comes about for kind of quite a few reasons. It's to do with better seeds, better soil preparation through selective breeding of animals. There's also another very important factor here that was very contentious at the time for the people that lived through it, and is now contentious in quite what it means for the agricultural revolution, productivity. And that's something called enclosure. And this is actually one of these things, there's a real folk memory in some sort of parts of British society about the dangers, one of the dangers, the evil consequences of enclosure. So what was enclosure? As the name suggests, it was when fields were fenced off. So it used to be, before enclosure, there was things called common fields. So they had a bit of field that they could farm for themselves, feed their family. Maybe some surplus would be sold for profit. And then starting the 17th century, these are enclosed. So that means they're brought together. The idea being this is more efficient. You don't have people kind of ploughing one bit of land on this side of the village, other bit of land on that side of the village. These kind of new processes that we've talked about can be applied across the fields as a whole. All well and good, except if you don't have a legal claim to your bit of common land, you might get kicked off that land and you're no longer able to farm it. So what enclosure does is it means there's lots of people that used to work in the countryside who no longer can. So that's very important as well.
And I guess that also contributes to our current picture of England as this kind of, the patchwork of fields and the hedgerows and all of that kind of stuff that we think of as quite a romantic image of Britain, but is actually a hangover of land being taken out of people's hands, rights being removed from people who had enjoyed those rights for centuries. It's a kind of physical scar, albeit we think of it as quite an attractive scar, but it's a physical scar of that change.
Absolutely. So that if you fly over Britain one way or another and you look down, there is that distinctive field pattern. If you look closely, or if you look at aerial photography, you can actually sometimes still see the individual stripes of the older field pattern as well, which is quite interesting. You've hit on something I think really important there when you talk about romanticisation, but we shouldn't underestimate the hardship of working in the land. You could work very, very hard and not have any food at the end of the season. Hunger was a common experience pre-agricultural revolution.
I love it when I accidentally make a good point.
So we have the agricultural revolution. So what this means is that less people are required to work the land, and this frees people up to work in the city. If less people are needed to work on the land, a smaller rural population can support a bigger urban population. And one of the factors in the Industrial Revolution is we see population grow. But before about 1750, population is remarkably steady, around about 5 million, with a big old blip for the Black Death in the medieval period. But it's about 5 million people. After 1750, it grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. It's about 17 million by 1851 and continues growing again. Of course, it's about 67 million today, and that's a really important consequence of industrialisation. So there's changes afoot in the countryside. There's also changes afoot in the kind of political system. So 17th century is a very kind of tumultuous century in British history. Reformation, Civil War, beheaded kings, all those sorts of grisly things. But from about 1689, it largely settles down. There is still a few important rebellions, the so-called Jacobite rebellions. But largely speaking, we have a stable political system from 1689. And this is really important because, what comes to mind when you think of the Industrial Revolution? Factories, machines, improvement. All that is investment. You don't invest your money in something expensive and stationary if you don't think it's going to be around. If there's civil war, if there's rebellion, stuff gets damaged, stuff gets stolen, all that sort of thing. You're not going to be investing in buildings and stuff. So this political stability is very important as well.
It's a fascinating collection of building blocks that almost needed to be in place for this to happen, that all seem to have aligned at around about the right time, all in the one place too. You mentioned before that 1750 is quite a safe date to go for the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
Safe-ish.
Yeah. Ish. What is it in particular that happens around then that is makes it a good point to kick things off at.
A good point. So at the heart of the Industrial Revolution is this idea, is finding kind of new forms of power. So new ways to kind of fuel activity, to kind of create useful stuff. We talked about life before the Industrial Revolution. It was hard work. If you wanted something doing, with a few exceptions around water and windmills, it needed to be muscle power, either your own or animal power. But the Industrial Revolution brings in new sources of power to do useful work. It starts in the British context as coal. Coal is used to heat steam. Steam is used to drive an engine. So this is what it comes down to, this new source of power. Running in parallel to that, there's a sense that you can, even if you don't have an extra source of power, you can make your kind of muscle power more efficient by the use of machines, by mechanization, through clever use of machines, gears, pulleys, all those various things that we think about when it comes to the Industrial Revolution. We can kind of get more work out of, we can be more efficient in the way we use our time to produce raw materials, particularly in cotton and wool, and cotton in particular at this stage. So we've got new power and new machines. We can then use the new power to power the machines. And now production is massively increasing. But because we need steam to drive, we need big steam engines to drive our machines, we can't work in our homes anymore. We can't work in these literal cottage industries anymore. We need to bring people together. And that gives birth to the factory system. So these three things combined, new sources of power, mechanization, and kind of bring people together, leads to our final output of industrialization. And that's when manufacturing, making stuff, takes over from growing stuff as the kind of the main source of the economy.
Yeah. I guess I'm struck slightly on the human level here that people have dealt with the agricultural revolution that's meant less people are required to do the same amount of work in the countryside, which has driven them to towns. And then all of a sudden, once they're there, they're faced by a situation where there are now changes in technology that mean that less people are required to do the muscle work there because machines are beginning to take over. And so this is all about a kind of reduction in the importance of individuals in these things as well. Everywhere, people are being replaced by technology.
Absolutely. So there's it's in a French context rather than English context, but there's quite a symbolic moment when a French factory owner puts some flowers on a machine saying that was my most productive worker of the week. We would have employee of the week. He was giving his machine employee of the week. And absolutely right. And there was a real sense that something had changed and something was changing people. Not overnight, over a course of generations, but people were learning a new way of working. And there was a lot of early resistance to this, quite harsh discipline when it came to getting people to learn this new way of work. So one obvious thing there is people had to learn what's called clock time. We take it for granted that we can tell the time. We have watches, we have clocks on our phones, computers, all this sorts of thing. Actually, you didn't need to know the time to that level of accuracy. You got up when it was light. You kind of went to bed, maybe when it was dark, maybe you had some lighting, but not, basic lighting. That was that. It doesn't matter if you start working your field at 6:10 or 7:10, loosely speaking. But the factory owners were keen that people would work from a fixed time, often 6 till 6, and a minute late, you'd be fined half a day's pay, for example. There's this idea that because so much money and capital has been put into the machines, they have to keep on working. They have to keep working for very long days. I don't know about you, but if I'm trying to justify an expensive purchase, I might be, now what's the cost per wear? What's the cost per use? And if I can say, well, actually, this might be more expensive, but if I use it more often, the cost comes down. A similar logic is at work by the factory owners. They've paid for these machines. They need to keep them working. And it's the machine that sets the pace and not the person.
And I think it's striking, again, how you can see the slow, gradual move from a situation in which the people are in control, albeit regulated slightly by nature, but then all of a sudden, thump, the machines are in command, and the people are now having to work to the rule of the machine and the factory owner. And I guess, that's where we will eventually get lots of industrial relations problems, because the people are starting to not matter as much as this inanimate object that is driving everything.
Absolutely right. And there is one of the factors of the Industrial Revolution is the work becomes less interesting. You have less ownership of it. You're de-skilled. It becomes monotonous. Now, there are benefits for workers. We shouldn't kind of go too far the other way. But one definite downside is that work becomes boring. It's something that's much harder to enjoy, and there's risks associated as well. So you really only doing it because you have to do it. And there's a sense, I think, that the early industrialists, with their kind of harsh discipline, their factory discipline, really set back later sort of industrial relations, because it was really that us and them sort of environment that was set up.
What are some of the main notable kind of technological advancements? We've talked a bit about steam engines, which I guess lead to trains. Electricity we associate with this period as well. Are these all of the things that are building up to speed up the Industrial Revolution and keep ahead of steam going, for want of a better phrase?
Absolutely. So for me, the railways is the big one. I'm quite parochial in my historical interest these days. I'm very much sort of London focused, and the railways have had such a massive impact on London history, on the kind of the connectivity between London and the rest of the country and the world.
Interesting for Assassin's Creed Syndicate that you would pick the railways when a lot of the game is centred around moving about the city using the railway and using a railway carriage as a base and all of that kind of thing. So really pulling in that idea that this is a revolutionary thing that is changing the country, the world.
Absolutely. Indeed. It just, again, hard to use too many superlatives about the changes that it makes.
How does kind of rapidly industrializing a nation and the changes that brings, how does that impact normal working people? I guess you've got more of them being crammed into smaller spaces in the city, being forced to work in factories to this rule of a machine rather than any kind of rule of nature. But you mentioned earlier as well that there's an increase in consumerism. So we know there's lots of negatives, I guess. Are there some positives to balance those things out?
Absolutely. And I think it's one of those things where the average person does well. Average means some people are doing very well and some people are doing badly. So the Industrial Revolution brings levels of kind of comfort and abundance that are unknown previously in human history. Historians don't really know whether it was good or bad for your average person for pre-1800. It's controversial from 1800 to 1850. And from 1850 onwards, there is a general rise in living standards. So your average person has more clothes, is better fed, has more money, all those sorts of things. But as we alluded to, that does disguise very great differences within that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a pretty stark, however hard the factories were, you're guaranteed money, which means food on the table.
Indeed. And I mean, I'm always careful saying this because I wouldn't want to work in a factory. It sounded very, very difficult. 12-hour days were the norm, noisy, dangerous. But the real problems came for people not so much when they were working as when they weren't working. So it was the precarity of work, or people that had only casual work.
The 0 hours contracts and the gig economy. Nothing ever changes, really, does it?
There are definite striking parallels to today.
Yeah. This might be a difficult question to answer, I guess, but why does London become considered the heart of the industrialised world?
That's really quite a tricky question. It's quite a nuanced question as well, because up until quite recently, there was a prevailing view among historians that London didn't industrialise at all, which I think really kind of flies in the face of what we think of London. We think of, talking about Syndicate, it's this quite smoky. I mean, I think it probably could be even dirtier, this sort of smoky, kind of dense century production. But the kernel of truth in that is that factories were less prevalent or less dominant part of the London economy than they were in somewhere like Manchester, for example. But what we also see in London, finishing goods. So there's that element to it. Jerry White, the very famous London historian, talks about how districts of London almost act like factories. So Whitechapel, obviously one of the levels in Assassin's Creed, is famously associated with the textile trade, but not necessarily making cotton and cloth in the way Manchester is, but in finishing that cloth, turning that cloth into usable garments. But really, London's claim to be at the heart of industrial world stands on two things, and it's the port and it's the City of London. So throughout the 18th and 19th century, London was the busiest port in the world. One of my favourite bits of Assassin's Creed is hopping from boat to boat across the Thames, because huge amount of trade going back and forth. And there is, of course, an imperial connection here. London's not just the capital of Britain at this point, it's the capital of the British Empire. And it's a real kind of central hub of all that trade coming kind of to and fro.
We need to remember, I think, that the Thames is probably something like a log-jammed motorway. You're sitting in traffic, it's just constantly packed with boats and ships. We'll see speedboats zipping up and down it today and tourist ships and stuff like that. But it would have been, chocker with ships coming in and out to the point where you could, leap across them as you do in the game. And we forget how busy it was. And I think the nearest equation for me is like a motorway in rush hour kind of thing.
Absolutely. We have some really wonderful photographs in our collections of the river, looking just that, of the docks being unloaded, but also just the sheer volume of river traffic. It's quite exceptional.
I'm also, before someone turns my fader down, I'm going to give a shout out to the West Midlands as the industrial centre of the world, but never mind.
But the point, you say that, but the point is the connection, isn't it? This is exactly the point of the Industrial Revolution, that it's, don't get me wrong, it's fun to sort of fly our flags through our little corner of the planet, but the very point is that goods from Birmingham are coming on the train to London, to the docks, and going away again, and vice versa.
Yeah, I'm being slightly facetious just for the sake of it, really. But I think the point is really that London provides the hub of the wheel. All of these spokes come together and they pour into London. And London is where they're able to bring all of this together from every corner of the country and every corner of the empire. And that's where that's where it is all focused, you know. I mean, London is the centre. Ugh. There you go, I said it. I wanted to end by asking you whether there is a single standout legacy of the Industrial Revolution, but it sounds from our conversation like it has effectively crafted what we consider to be everyday life today, that we go to work at a certain time, that we finish at a certain time, that we check our watches all day, that we consume a lot more than we ever used to in the past, all of those facets of it. And to add into that kind of the industrialization of warfare, you know, it sounds like some of the worst horrors of the 20th century were a legacy of the Industrial Revolution.
I think that's right. I think that what it comes down to for me with the legacy Industrial Revolution is it's the most profound change in sort of human history since we started farming 12,000 years ago. And something of that magnitude is going to encompass all the good and all the dark as well. To add one more not very cheery thing to the dark list as well, when we talked about the Industrial Revolution hinging on new forms of power, fossil fuels, we have to add climate change to that list as well. Some of it has already happened, some of it will already continue to happen, but depending on sort of the political, economic and technological choices of the next few decades, we'll find out quite how much climate change we have. And then maybe at that point we can sort of really say what the legacy of the Industrial Revolution was.
Yeah. It's a slightly frightening one. Thanks for watching Echoes of History. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the real history behind the Assassin's Creed games, then subscribe for more episodes. You can check out the extended interviews wherever you get your podcasts by clicking the link in the description. And you should probably click on one of the links on screen too for more great content from History Hit. Are you still here? Click a link, watch a video. It's much better than watching me tell you to go and watch a video.